Mr. President, I rise to speak in opposition to the resolution which uses the Congressional Review Act process to overturn what is a Fish and Wildlife Service resolution prohibiting certain inhumane methods of killing bears and wolves within the 16 national wildlife refuges in Alaska. That's about 20% of the wildlife refuges that maintain within the state of Alaska. I understand that the opponents of the Fish and Wildlife Service are arguing that the state and the state's rights issue are at hand, and they're responsible for the management of fish and wildlife in the state. That is certainly true within the state, but on federal fish and wildlife land, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is in charge. Just like at Mount Rainier or Olympic National Park, the National Park Service is in charge. I'm sure there are times that Pierce County or even Seattle would like to make rules related to Mount Rainier, but they're not allowed because it is part of our national park system. So is the Fish and Wildlife Service, part of our national system. The rules in this proposal only apply to those wildlife refuge lands in Alaska. They don't cover anything else in the state of Alaska. So this isn't about states' rights. It's about how we can manage these wildlife refuges to the degree that agencies believe are for the preservation of these wildlife heritage areas. Managing these wildlife 16 federal refuges in Alaska are about the management policies that are consistent with keeping a wildlife refuge. It's not about prohibiting hunting. In fact, hunting has been allowed and will continue to be allowed, and hunting will be allowed within these refuges in Alaska, as is the case with most wildlife refuges throughout the United States. As my colleague who was out here earlier from New Mexico pointed out, this is about what people want to see when they go to see wildlife refuges. Do they want to see the inhumane killing of cub bears in a den, or would they like to see the bear and fishing activity that exists in so many of these beautiful areas? Another argument that has been raised is that this rule will stop Alaskans from hunting from subsistence purposes, Native Americans and other subsistence hunting. This rule says nothing about this. This is only about our wildlife refuges. There is also, specifically, some people think that this is contrary to what are the responsible wildlife and management practices in other states. This rule only applies to certain wildlife refuges in the state of Alaska. The actions that Alaska has authorized are so aggressive on their state lands, permitting them on federal refuge land would be counter to the purposes of these national wildlife refuges. I know one of my colleagues was here citing what they think is already prohibited under federal law, but the Alaska Administrative Code, which I will enter into the record, does allow for carbon monoxide cartridges to be used in humane euthanizing in these dens of wolf or bear dens and killing of young animals. So that is in Alaska Code today, and it is something that the wildlife management, U.S. wildlife management team does not want to see happen. The killing methods authorized by state of Alaska include killing bear cubs or mothers with cubs, killing brown bears, including grizzly bears, using bait, killing brown bears using traps or snares, killing wolves or coyotes and their pups during the denning season, and shooting bears or wolves from aircraft or helicopters, using the aircraft to track down the bears or wolves and then landing and shooting them. When you see the list of prohibited actions, you have to wonder why anybody would oppose this rule. Who is advocating for the slaughtering of wolf pups or bear cubs in their dens, shooting them from aircrafts, or using snares to catch by its neck and then kill them? I think my colleague from New Mexico had a picture of such an event. So who is advocating for this kind of methods? So this is why the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Policy makes sure that the predatory controls used are based on science and not these inhumane actions. The wildlife rule is not a case of regulating sportsmen for traditional hunting practices, but it is making sure that they are doing so in a humane way. The law requires that the Alaska Wildlife Refuges be managed to conserve fish and wildlife populations in their natural diversity. But Alaska's predatory control practices are not consistent with that management requirement. They are directly opposite to conserving the natural diversity and are instead promoting the wholesale killing of predator species. So that is why we oppose this override of this regulation. I hope my colleagues will turn it down. If we want to make improvements to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife rule, we can do so by legislation or working on a Fish and Wildlife Service rule. But by turning down this rule, you are also prohibiting the agency from their job of protecting the wildlife refuge. I want to make sure that all our colleagues understand that this is about protecting wildlife refuges in a humane way, allowing hunting and practices of hunting, but doing so in a way that preserves the species. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.